On a cold January night in Detroit in 1984, a city already gripped by fear was about to face its worst nightmare. 4 months, a terrifying pattern had emerged. 47 girls had been raped on their way to school between September 1983 and February 1984, a series of attacks that had paralyzed the community and left parents terrified to let their children walk to class. The media dubbed them the schoolgirl rapes, and Detroit was demanding answers. Then, on January 25, 1984, the unthinkable happened. 16-year-old Michelle Jackson was found murdered in an abandoned garage on Detroit's east side. The crime was brutal beyond comprehension. She had been raped, strangled with a pair of long johns, and violated with a glass bottle. Her partially clothed body told the story of her final, horrifying moments. She had last been seen at her bus stop, heading to school like any normal morning. When she didn't come home that night, her family contacted police. Neighbors and family members organized search parties, desperately hoping to find her alive. Instead, they found her cold and lifeless in that vacant garage. The city erupted in outrage and fear. Parents refused to let their daughters leave the house. Schools implemented escort policies. The pressure on Detroit police to solve this case and stop the epidemic of violence against young girls became unbearable. Detectives needed a suspect, needed a confession, needed to show the terrified public that someone would be held accountable. And somewhere inside the Detroit Psychiatric Institute, a vulnerable man named Eddie Joe Lloyd was about to become their answer. Eddie had been diagnosed by psychiatrists with bipolar affective disorder and exhibited symptoms including grandiosity, flight of ideas, and a substantial disorder of thought or mood which significantly impairs judgment, behavior, capacity to recognize reality, or ability to cope with the ordinary demands of life. His illness made reality fluid and unreliable. Sometimes he believed he possessed special powers or knowledge. Other times, he struggled to distinguish between what was real and what his fractured mind constructed. In the midst of his treatment at the psychiatric facility, Eddie developed what seemed like a harmless habit. He wrote letters to police. Lots of them. He had written 15 to 17 letters to police saying he had information about various crimes and the perpetrators' identities. To Eddie, these letters made him feel useful, important, connected to the world outside the hospital walls. To police, he was largely considered a nuisance, just another mentally ill person with delusions of helping solve crimes. But then came the letter about Michelle Jackson. 9 months after Jackson's body was found, Lloyd wrote a letter to police from his psychiatric unit stating he would help in the investigation of Jackson's death, saying he knew a bottle had been found in her vagina. The detail was wrong. The bottle had actually been found in her rectum, but it was close enough to catch detectives' attention. Unlike his previous letters, this one they couldn't ignore. Detectives visited Eddie at the Detroit Psychiatric Institute. What happened during those visits would become one of the most disturbing examples of police manipulation in American legal history. The officers didn't treat Eddie like a suspect at first. They treated him like an ally. They praised his desire to help. They told him he could be instrumental in catching Michelle's killer. Police officers allowed Lloyd to believe that, by confessing and getting arrested, he would help them smoke out the real perpetrator. Think about that for a moment. Detectives convinced a mentally ill man, someone whose very diagnosis meant he couldn't properly recognize reality or cope with ordinary demands, that pretending to be a murderer would help catch the actual murderer. They weaponized his illness against him, exploiting his desperate need to matter, to be seen, to be helpful. And then, piece by piece, they fed him the crime. They fed him details that he could not have known, including the location of the body, the type of jeans the victim was wearing, a description of earrings the victim wore, and other details from the crime scene. They told him about Michelle's Gloria Vanderbilt jeans. They described her half-moon earrings. They mentioned the red-handled knife used to threaten her. They revealed the long johns that had strangled her. They explained about the dirty green bottle left in her rectum. Each time Eddie repeated these details back to them, they praised him. They reinforced his cooperation. They made him believe he was doing something heroic. His fractured mind, desperate for approval and unable to grasp the consequences, absorbed it all. Lloyd signed a written confession and gave a tape-recorded statement as well. The confession stretched to 6 pages, filled with horrific details, all of which had come from the mouths of the detectives who questioned him. Eddie had created nothing. He had simply become the mouthpiece for someone else's script. And then came the betrayal that Eddie never saw coming. The moment he signed that confession, the police arrested him for the girl's murder. He immediately felt betrayed. They had told him this would help catch the real killer. Instead, he was the one being charged with murder. He tried desperately to protest his innocence, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Who would believe a mentally ill man who had just confessed in chilling detail to rape and murder? What happened next wasn't a trial, it was a travesty dressed up as justice. Lloyd was represented during pre-trial by a court-appointed attorney who received $150 for pre-trial preparation and investigation. This attorney gave $50 of this to a convicted felon, who conducted no investigation into Lloyd's mental state or confession. Think about that. The total budget for investigating whether this mentally ill man was innocent of rape and murder was $150, and a third of it went to someone with a criminal record who never even met Eddie or looked into the circumstances of his confession. Then this lawyer withdrew from the case 8 days before trial, but another attorney was appointed and the trial was not postponed. A new lawyer, given virtually no time to prepare, was expected to mount a defense in a capital murder case. The trial attorney did not meet with the pre-trial attorney. He did not question the details of the investigation and did not cross-examine the police officer most directly involved in the coerced confession. He called no defense witnesses and gave a 5-minute closing argument. 5 minutes? In a murder trial. The attorney later lamented in the press that his client wouldn't allow an insanity defense, saying with a psychiatric plea, "We might have had a chance." But the confession was all the prosecution needed. They played the tape recording for the jury. They presented the 6-page written statement. They showed jurors a man who knew details only the killer could know, never mentioning that police had fed him every single one. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before convicting him of first-degree felony murder in May 1985. Less than an hour to decide that a mentally ill man should spend the rest of his life in prison. At sentencing, Judge Dalton Roberson expressed his frustration that Michigan had abolished the death penalty. He told the courtroom he believed Eddie deserved execution. He lamented that he could only sentence Eddie to life in prison rather than what he called the only justifiable sentence. When given a chance to speak, Lloyd answered, "Into each life tears must fall. That means on both sides. MJ, the victim, had a right to live as we all do." She said goodbye and disappeared in the darkness, never to be seen again alive. One day later she was found in a vacant garage. Cold, alone, and lifeless, Eddie Lloyd was focused on as a suspect while he was a mental patient, and somewhere along the line he was charged and convicted of the crime, a heinous crime, brutal. What I want to say to the court is that, to the family, MJ, to the city of Detroit, to everybody who was involved with the case, I did not kill MJ. I never killed anybody in my life and I wouldn't. His words fell on deaf ears. Eddie Joe Lloyd disappeared into the Michigan prison system and the case was closed. Michelle Jackson's real killer walked free. Prison is devastating for anyone. For someone with severe mental illness, it's torture. Eddie's condition deteriorated behind bars. The voices grew louder. The delusions intensified. The prison medical system, overwhelmed and underfunded, could barely keep him stable. And through it all, Eddie clung to a belief that seemed crazy even by his standards. He believed the detectives would eventually come back and thank him for helping them find the real killer. He genuinely thought he had been helping. He appealed his conviction repeatedly. Lloyd wrote to the court saying his appellate assistance was lacking, and the appellate attorney wrote that Lloyd should not be taken seriously because he was guilty and should die. His own lawyer believed he deserved death. All of his appeals failed. But in 1995, something changed. Eddie contacted the Innocence Project, a legal organization dedicated to exonerating wrongfully convicted people through DNA testing. He asked them to test the biological evidence for Michelle Jackson's murder. The Innocence Project believed him. But first they had to find the evidence. 4 years, students and attorneys from the Innocence Project searched Detroit's evidence storage facilities. Evidence from 1984 was supposed to be retained, but old cases often had evidence that was mislabeled, misfiled, or simply lost. The search seemed hopeless. Finally, with assistance from the Wayne County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, they found it. Semen had been collected from multiple items at the crime scene. From a broken glass bottle, from a piece of paper, from the stain on the long johns used to strangle Michelle, and from samples taken during her autopsy. In the late 1990s, DNA testing that didn't exist in 1984 could now tell them definitively who had killed Michelle Jackson. DNA testing conducted by Forensic Science Associates and confirmed by the Michigan State Crime Lab found the same unknown male profile from sperm cells on the broken glass bottle, the piece of paper, the stain on the long johns, and samples collected from the victim's body during the autopsy. Each of these profiles excluded Eddie Joe Lloyd. Every single piece of biological evidence pointed to the same man, and that man was not Eddie Joe Lloyd. The DNA belonged to someone else entirely. The real killer had left his genetic signature all over the crime scene, and it matched none of Eddie's DNA. The confession that had sent him to prison for 17 years was exactly what Eddie had always said it was, a fabrication fed to him by police. On August 26, 2002, Eddie Joe Lloyd walked out of prison a free man. He was 53 years old. He had entered prison in his mid-30s and emerged nearly 2 decades later, his health shattered, his mind still fragile, struggling to understand a world that had moved on without him. He was exonerated and released on August 26, 2002, after serving 17 years in prison for a rape and murder he didn't commit. He became the 110th person in American history to be exonerated through DNA evidence. The victim's mother, Carlotta Jackson, was devastated. "I never questioned any of the evidence," she said. "My faith was in them. I just knew they had the right person. I was just so naive," Jackson said through racking sobs. "I was just so trusting. Unbelievable." Not only had her daughter's real killer never been caught, but an innocent man had spent 17 years in prison because of detectives she had trusted completely. Eddie tried to rebuild his life, but the damage was irreversible. 17 years of incarceration had destroyed his already fragile health. The mental illness that had never been properly treated in prison had worsened. His body was failing. Lloyd filed a suit against the city and Wayne County in federal court, naming homicide detective William Rice and others who coerced his false confession. He wanted accountability. He wanted the world to know what had been done to him. But Eddie Joe Lloyd never lived to see full justice. He died on September 22, 2004, because of medical complications arising during his incarceration, just 2 years and 27 days after walking out of prison. His estate sued. A June 22, 2006, settlement agreement requires the Detroit Police Department to make electronic video and audio recordings of all interrogations of any suspect in an investigation in a homicide case or that carries a possible life sentence without parole. The settlement also awarded his estate $4,075,000, with distributions going to pay his debts and to his daughter, sister, and brother. Detective William Rice, who had coerced Eddie's confession, later faced criminal enterprise, fraud, conspiracy, and drug charges, a detail that raises disturbing questions about the credibility of the man who had extracted Eddie's false confession in the first place. Eddie's case became a watershed moment in criminal justice reform. Because of him, Detroit now requires recording of all interrogations in serious cases. His story is taught in law schools as a cautionary tale about the dangers of false confessions, particularly with vulnerable populations. But Michelle Jackson's murder remains unsolved. The real killer, whose DNA is on file, has never been identified or caught. 2 families were destroyed by this case. Michelle's family, who never got justice for their daughter, and Eddie's family, who watched their brother and father be consumed by a system meant to protect the innocent. Eddie Joe Lloyd should never have been questioned without proper mental health protections. He should never have been manipulated into a false confession. He should never have been convicted on the basis of that coerced statement. He should never have spent 17 years in prison. And he should have lived long enough to truly enjoy his freedom. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. In our rush to solve crimes and comfort victims' families, how many other Eddie Joe Lloyds are sitting in cells right now, destroyed by a system that valued expediency over truth? The answer should terrify us all.